Welcome to our seminar here this afternoon. We were here last Friday, so we've got a whole series of seminars over the last couple of weeks from the NA and Youth Community and Social Regeneration and the Department of Sociology. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Dave O'Brien, Dr. Dave O'Brien. Dave is Chancellor's Fellow in Cultural and Creative Industries at the University of Edinburgh. He did his PhD in Sociology at the University of Liverpool, looking at the European capital of culture, some term that many of us are very familiar with here in Limerick City over the last number of years. And Dave has published widely on all areas of cultural and creative industries, including cultural policy, urban regeneration, cultural work, public policy, and cultural consumption. And his research currently covers 5 areas, namely cultural policy, urban policy, public administration, cultural value, and cultural work. And these themes are captured by a range of recently completed and ongoing projects, and he's the host of the New Books in Critical Theory podcast. And of course, Dave has a lively presence on Twitter, and you can follow him on Twitter at Dr. Dave O'Brien. So you're very welcome to Limerick, Dave.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me over. So what I'm going to do is talk about an ongoing research project about work and labour in cultural and creative industries, which is sort of sprawled to include questions about social mobility, different forms of inequality in these jobs, in these occupations, as well as kind of bigger themes about, I guess, broader social inequalities around gender, ethnicity, and social class. I think I'll start off with a little bit of context, and I should say I'm basically going to talk about lots and lots of different papers, which I'll sort of give you links at the end. So, I'm alright to move about here. So basically, I think about 3 years ago now, myself and a colleague, Sam Friedman, who's now at the LSE, were basically quite sort of concerned isn't the right word, but we sort of noticed that like basically every week, one of the Sunday broadsheets, or there'd be a kind of like a thing in the Daily News, or maybe one of the kind of weekly or monthly politics magazines in the UK was talking about inequality and cultural production. Now this isn't a particularly kind of new phenomenon. These debates and issues have sort of rumbled on in the academic literature. There's almost 20 years of discussions about culture and creative work and labour. But we were particularly struck by a bunch of issues that came to the surface around the, I guess, class basis of cultural and creative industry. So I've just put some headlines up, stuff about whether society has become too posh in terms of culture. History of art shouldn't just be a subject for posh girls. Benedict Cumberbatch on whether he's middle class. Posh UK actors spark concern over elitism. James Blunt versus Chris Bryant. Blunt calling him a classist gimp. This kind of stuff. So this was the kind of background noise that started off a whole bunch of different work on culture and creative industries. And basically, Sam and I discussed various ways we could kind of think through some of these issues. One of the kind of classic frustrations, I think, for a social scientist is to see media discussions where you think, hang on, we can probably find out who is right in that debate. We can probably tell you whether the arts are too middle class, or whether working class voices are really strong. And we can probably tell you stuff about whether women are being given the wrong kind of representations, or whether the arts are too white or whatever, by basically kind of doing a bit of possibly what you call public sociology. So in order to do that, we kind of sat down and discussed some work that Sam was doing with a colleague called Daniel Lorison, who now works over in the States. And they were doing work about basically the class basis of key top professions in the UK. And our discussion basically said, well, look, if we can do this for lawyers, doctors, accountants, we can probably do it as well for people working in cultural jobs. So in a paper published, I think about 2 years, 18 months ago now, we looked at using the Office for National Statistics Labour Force Survey at the composition of cultural and creative industries in the UK. So this first table gives you an overview of cultural creative industries in the UK, basically by a range of different characteristics apart from social class, because I'm going to deal with that in subsequent slides. slide. So what we can see here is broadly a story of the creative industries being whiter than the population as a whole, so kind of less representative of those from non-white ethnicities, being very well educated, better educated than the population as a whole, and having some real imbalances in terms of gender representation. We can also see from this that the creative industries are slightly skewed by what the government counts as a creative job. So IT, software and computer services, we can see is very, very male, is actually quite diverse in terms of its ethnicity, is very well educated, much sort of better educated than the population in general, but it makes up almost 30% of the cultural creative industries. It's not exactly the sort of like core cultural job you'd think of, whereas something like museums, galleries and libraries is much more feminised, but it's much whiter than the general population and it's much better educated. But it's only a tiny part of the overall cultural creative industries in the UK. So although the story here is one of kind of well-educated, white, and in some places quite feminised, in other places quite masculine occupations, there is, I guess, a kind of a note of caution about talking about the creative sector as a whole. What about social class? So, I keep doing the wrong thing. There we go. So this table shows the class composition of the creative sector as a whole in the UK. And what we can see here is that NSEC 1 is basically the kind of top profession. So this table is talking about those people whose parents were in things like law or medicine or running, with having senior managerial roles when they were young people, when they were sort of 14 or 16. NSEC 6 to 8 is more kind of working class occupations or people whose parents had never worked. And here we can see that what the LFS data from 2014 tells us is that the creative industries as a whole have an overrepresentation of those from kind of affluent or professional social origins, just over a quarter of those people in the creative industries as a whole. And this is an overrepresentation compared to the population as a whole. Only about 14% of the population have those professional senior managerial parents. But it's also an overrepresentation compared to those from more working class backgrounds. So in creative jobs as a whole, what we can see is a sort of an overrepresentation of the elite, or at least those with elite parental occupations, compared to the rest of the population, but also an overrepresentation compared to those from working class backgrounds. Now, I mentioned, kind of be cautious about this creative industries label because of the differences within particular occupations. And when we when we break down the individual occupations, I mean, this is very tiny, you can see it better in the paper. What we see is that some sectors have much kind of worse class biases than others. To take the top line, for example, publishing, so those people who are authors or journalists, working in newspapers, or translators, people, I'd argue, who are responsible for the kind of literary culture that Britain has, are really, really skewed towards those from elite or professional social origins. So 43, just over 43% of those working in publishing have parents who are in kind of elite professional occupations when they were young. This is obviously a big overrepresentation compared to that 18% of the population, but also it's a really big overrepresentation compared to those from routine, semi-routine, kind of more working class occupational backgrounds, who are only about 12% of the people who, according to the Labour Force survey, are working in publishing, or were working in publishing in 2014. It varies, some sectors are sort of slightly better than others. Film industry or film, TV, video, etc. Is slightly better in terms of representation. We think this is to do with the range of occupations in film, television, radio, etc. Lots of people kind of working behind the camera, people who are now quite well established in their careers, maybe in their 40s, have different occupational mobility routes into the job. But in terms of some of our kind of core, I guess, cultural jobs, museums, music, publishing, there is this really big overrepresentation of what we might think of as the children of elite social backgrounds. So we think there is a bit of a class problem in cultural and creative industries. We think there's also a problem about race, and in certain jobs there's a problem in terms of the gender balance as well. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is sort of slightly unpack this in terms of some things we've been working on using self-selecting web survey data, which I know has lots of problems with it, and then talk about a particular case study of acting and actors to talk about the kind of professional routes that maybe leave us with this uneven class settlement in culture and creative jobs. So I'm just going to skip over pay rates because that's not relevant. So at the end of 2015, myself, Sam, Daniel and Mark Taylor, who's at the University of Sheffield, along with an arts organisation in London called Create, my university at the time, Goldsmiths, and then the Barbican as well, worked with The Guardian to try and commission some survey research on who was working in cultural and creative jobs. Now, there were loads of issues with self-selecting online survey data. The major one you might be able to spot is, if you're going to commission a survey, don't put the word like panic in huge letters at the top of it. That might, somewhat skew some of the results, or at least, start off people in perhaps the wrong frame of mind to give you objective social science. But that aside, we got some really interesting data. And we got interesting data in kind of two ways. The first way was we asked a whole bunch of questions to do with people's incomes, their social origins, their educational backgrounds, lots of stuff about attitudes, about what we call kind of social capital data, and we got just under 2,500 responses to that. Whilst there are kind of issues about who those people are, broadly speaking, they have a similar class basis to the kinds of class distributions we'd see in cultural and creative industries. Basically, they were all quite middle class. They had similar kind of attitudinal distributions to what we've seen in some work we've done, which I'm not going to talk about today, but some work we've done on British social attitudes data. And interestingly, they had similar kind of educational backgrounds as well. There was an overrepresentation of those from BAME backgrounds and an overrepresentation of women compared to cultural creative industries. So that's something to think about. As well as our survey data, we went out and interviewed 238 people on the back of this, which is an incredible, rich, detailed data set. It's a lot of people. So, we're still kind of, where are we? Getting on for 2 years later, still working through this data, but we've started to publish working papers on the back of it as well. And we've got some really interesting stuff about individuals' career trajectories that try and account for that broad ONS, labour force survey picture I showed you. So, from the web survey data, one of the things we were interested in was, what is it about the kind of attitudes of those working in cultural and creative jobs that maybe mean that some people kind of get ahead and some people don't? So we asked a pretty standard, you see this a lot on American social surveys, a pretty standard question about how important people think particular things are to kind of getting ahead in their chosen occupation. And we clustered these things, well, I say Mark Taylor, who did this particular bit of analysis, clustered the responses into two general categories. We have social reproduction, which is things like coming from a wealthy family, whether you're the right ethnicity, the right gender, the right social class, the right religion. And then we have things that are to do with meritocracy. So, for example, hardworking, being talented. These are the two kinds, clusters of responses that we carved up the people answering this question into. And what's really interesting is, from our survey respondents at least, we have a story of people working in cultural and creative industries who responded to our survey, posted on The Guardian with the title panic, were quite strongly invested in some form of meritocracy as an explanation for how people succeed in their chosen occupations. So meritocracy, or a variation of meritocracy and social reproduction together, accounted for well over half of our respondents. So just under a third of respondents were telling us that it really is to do with hard work, to do with talent. That's how you kind of get in and get on in creative occupations. Or they were telling us hard work, talent are important, but also actually, it is about your social origin, it is about who you know, it's about, your gender, this kind of stuff. Interestingly, the people who were most likely to give us its meritocracy were those older men who were white in the most well-paid occupations, or at least most well-paid occupations in the cluster of respondents to our survey, which suggests to us that there is a bit of a problem here, that broadly speaking, from this possibly unrepresentative survey, the story of cultural creative industries is one that people think, broadly speaking, that talent and hard work are rewarded. And crucially, those people, those middle-aged, white, well-paid men who are likely to be making decisions, who are most likely to be in kind of commissioning roles or senior executive roles, heads of organisations, were the most likely in our survey to say that hard work and talent are what is rewarded. So we think, to make an almost kind of classic Borgesian mode, that there is a lot of misrecognition going on here about how this set of jobs functions. But obviously, there are issues with that in terms of projecting this sample onto the creative industries as a whole. I'm going to continue, though, with some of this survey analysis, because there is another kind of interesting angle here. We also asked people to tell us stuff about their social capital, about their social position. So we asked people, what kind of occupations do you know? Do you know a bus driver, a factory worker? Do you know a software developer, a journalist, an actor, an artist? We were interested in the kinds of, I suppose, occupational networks that people answering our survey were invested in. And broadly speaking, what we can see is that our sample, again, despite its issues about self-selection, etc., were least likely to know occupations that we dissociate with working class jobs. So they were least likely to know bus drivers, factory workers, electricians, secretaries, this kind of thing. They were also very unlikely to know bank managers, which might tell you something about working in the arts, but that's probably a discussion for another time. And what was particularly interesting to us was a comparison with a much more kind of robust and well validated social survey, which was the culture, class and social exclusion work that was done kind of 10 years ago now. It underpinned a book called Culture, Class, Distinction, which is published by Tony Bennett, Modesta Cal, Elizabeth Silver. There's loads of authors on that book. And interestingly, although our data, the panic data set, skewed more towards, they know a lot more lecturers than the culture, class, social exclusion, NSF 1 and 2 kind of elites. They look more like the kind of top end of the professions in British society. This is interesting to us in a couple of ways. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that there is a kind of a class issue in terms of who gets in, according to the labour force survey. But in terms of the kind of like the occupational basis, the occupational networks that our respondents know, we also think there's an issue that they look more like professions that have similar class biases. So instead of, hosting debates on is there a class problem in acting, or do you have to be rich to get a number one in Britain or whatever, we should probably be talking about why is it that lots of senior professions, at least using position generator work, are socially closed. Why is it that our respondents look more like the kind of senior professions who were telling culture, class and social exclusion 10 years ago that they didn't really know bus drivers, they didn't know postmen, they didn't know people working in factories. So that's another kind of line for our social closure explanation. So we started off reviewing some of the qualitative interview data, and broadly speaking, we can paint a picture of a sector that has particular norms attached to it. In another paper, I'm going to sort of gesture towards this, myself and Sam Friedman have drawn on Namal Puar's work to talk about the somatic norm in acting, but we also think this same somatic norm extends across many of the cultural and creative occupations in the UK, which is that the kind of like default individual that's both privileged but also imagined in these occupations is a white man from a middle class occupational background. Interestingly, I've not touched on sort of disability and sexuality. Sexuality is stuff that we're trying to tease out of the data, but we haven't really started that yet. But in terms of able-bodiedness, this is a kind of a powerful default that almost is kind of unspoken, apart from those, at least in our fieldwork, who had disabilities themselves. It was really interesting that many of our interviewees were kind of able to recognise structures reflexively of whiteness, maleness and middle classness, but they didn't gesture towards disability. So that's something that we want to kind of pursue when we do further analysis. Fascinatingly, this sector is incredibly reflexive. So in sort of other projects, I've done some work with civil servants who are brilliant and wonderful and interesting. They are not very reflexive. So if you interview a civil servant and say, what's your job? They'll be like, I'm grade 7. And then they'll just kind of stop. And you'll be like, so what does that mean? I advise the minister. Like, well, come on, give me a bit more here. Whereas like if you say, I don't know, to a musician, tell me about your job, you'll get full life history, an hour, you'll be desperate to kind of like claw them back and stuff like this. Similar with artists and actors. Really kind of brilliant interviewees who are very, very reflexive. So, they're able to kind of identify all of the issues that sociology has come up with in the sector of, institutional sexism, the, kind of lack of prominent non-white people in particularly senior decision-making roles, the kind of different class biases, the privileges of having, again, what the Budgesians would call economic, social, and cultural capital. But they would all obviously disavow that this was anything to do with them. So it'd be like you get these kind of detailed sociological analyses of publishing by senior white middle class men, and then you'd say, so how did you get your current job? And they'd be like, I just got parachuted in to run a team full of women because we didn't think they could do the job. And it'd be like, come on, So this we find really, really interesting. And again, I think there's space for some theorisation. And crucially, as I kind of gesture towards, the belief in meritocracy is really, really important to working in culture. There are social patterns attached to it, but essentially what we're dealing with here is a sector that recognises it has a problem, but almost the recognition of the problem is one of the barriers that stops the sector changing, stops it being more generally representative of the rest of British society. I've got some stuff that we're pulling out of the interviews at the moment, but I'm going to go straight to think about a case study. So the project before the Panic project, as I say, we published a couple of working papers. We're about to publish a couple more in the moment, but it's all still much of it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, stuff like that. So a couple of papers that we have published in sociology, and we've got one coming out in cultural sociology, is about acting. And we think acting is a really good way of sort of exploring the issues that I've been gesturing towards, partially because it's a kind of an ideal type for much of what the debates around cultural and creative work have been saying about issues of kind of precariousness, about the responsibility for the occupation and risk-taking being put onto the individual, highly dependent on networks, but offers great rewards for some and is bound up with forms of kind of self-expression and also the kind of the potential to be a sort of autonomous, creative individual. All of those things are usually attached to cultural and creative occupations, and we think they're very much attached to acting. But also, crucially, a lot of us at the moment, there's a kind of big bunch of us who are interested in the intersection between production, consumption, and the kinds of representations we have. So there's 4 of us editing a special issue of cultural sociology at the moment that tries to connect these 3 often disconnected bits of cultural analysis. And we think acting is one of those jobs where you see this triangle really, really obviously. If you deal with, say, classical music, it's reasonably possible that you'll have sections of the population that have never engaged, participated or consumed forms of classical music, even in terms of kind of film scores or something like that. We think, as a kind of rough starting point, it's impossible to avoid actors, even if you only ever watch advertising or only listen to the radio. If you're a kind of say, an elite aesthetic Radio 4 listener who will have nothing else but Radio 4 on, right through to even if you only watch, kind of cartoons or whatever, you're likely to have encountered the cultural products of acting. So we think it's an important occupation beyond just the kind of literature. And crucially, the somatic norms I gestured towards in the panic data are really obvious in acting as well. So, just to do a bit of ground clearing, we used Great British Class Survey data. Sam and Daniel were working on the Great British Class Survey when we were working through this work. Respondents to the Great British Class Survey, over 70% of them were from managerial and professional occupational backgrounds. So, we think of them as having these kind of elite, professional, upper middle class occupational backgrounds. Only about 10% of the GBCS respondents who were working as actors when they responded to GBCS were from manual working class occupations. There are loads of issues that have come up in the sociology literature about the Great British Class Survey. This basically mirrors the stuff we've seen from the Labour Force Survey, but is aggravated towards the upper middle class. So the Labour Force Survey, for example, says about 50% of actors were from elite, upper middle class occupational backgrounds. So, the GBCS is not giving us anything like wildly different in terms of the trends. Although there are issues about that particular data set, there's a special issue of sociology you can see these debates in. We did some class pay gap analysis using GBCS data that suggested basically actors, who in the same occupation were earning about £10,000 a year less compared to those from middle class backgrounds, even when we adjust for age, gender, ethnicity, education, and location. Again, there are debates around GBCS as a kind of robust data set on income, but this matches and tracks class pay gaps that we found in LFS data on other culture and creative occupations. So, how do we explain this? Now, occupations are different from each other, so this isn't exactly the same for musicians or people working in museums or web designers or whatever, but we're seeing similar trends as we start to pick apart the panic data. So we think it starts young. I've got two examples here. Carl, from an affluent middle class background, he'd been quite a successful actor when we interviewed him, and we were talking about his kind of childhood experiences, and he was telling us that even before he was 18, he was expecting Hamlet, Macbeth. He was preparing to win the Academy Award. He would be running the Royal Shakespeare Company. No one had to direct him. He had this tunnel vision about his success. We can compare this with Lucy, who was kind of starting out, but she had some prominent television work when we spoke to her. So, she was sort of reasonably successful in the industry, and her working class, and actually crucially her regional background, led to a story about, the thought never entered my head of being an actress. It wasn't an option. I just thought economically it wasn't for poor people like me. And this, I think, is one of the kind of moments that the leaky pipeline for talent presents itself in terms of why we don't have a better class representation in acting. But also it gestures towards some of the issues of gender, and I'll come to ethnicity later on as well. Drama school, we think, is crucial here. Raheem, very, very affluent background, told us his kind of personal story of selecting a drama school that was like, congratulate the drama school for having been chosen by you. Don't think that they're giving you the place. You are gracing them with your presence. We contrast this with John, 45. Again, had had quite a good long career as an actor. I'd had no experience of middle class life. I was thrown into this middle class environment. I was a fish out of water. The rules are very different to the rules I grew up with. It fucks with your confidence, it fucks with your head. And this was quite a common story, actually, that even where those from less affluent social origins had managed to get into the drama schools, they had pretty, kind of unpleasant times there, ranging from the kinds of things that they get cast in. So one of our working class origin men told us that he always played the hotel barman or the older pensioner guy compared with his more affluent origin men playing the lead role, through to particular gender assumptions that are attached to social class as well. Getting paid is really important. This we've picked up more generally in a working paper that uses the panic data set. Really what we were seeing around getting paid was that after people leave drama school, sometimes they're able to access the best agents, sometimes they're not. It depends really on the drama school they go to and the kind of networks that drama school has, particularly if it's based in London. But if they do get an agent and if they do get into the profession, they're presented with the problem of being paid. So Arthur, who's in his 20s, told us the kind of advantages. Sam's a Budgesian, so he likes to think about this in economic capital terms. I'm more interested in sort of resources, but the advantages that come from having affluent parents. The Oyster card is refused. I'll call my mum. I couldn't do this if it wasn't for her. That's an obvious kind of advantage. But this advantage helped when he was being cast, so he could go to auditions, and he compared himself to his flatmate, who works flat out at a restaurant. All of his energy and time is going, into a place where you don't want to be. And if you get a phone call from the agent, you don't have time to prepare. You're less likely to be able to prepare with, the part kind of off book, as they call it. And so this presented a clear advantage in the labour market for Arthur. But crucially, it presented an advantage in another way. Arthur narrated unpaid labour to us as a form of creative freedom. So rather than struggling with internships across, say the museum sector or getting into publishing or whatever, for actors, the possibility of doing, student films or putting on a play at Edinburgh or, doing a profit share or something like this, these types of unpaid labour in Arthur's affluent social origin, London-based narrative was, all my contacts, my friends, my network, we were doing fringe stuff, pub stuff, there wasn't the budget, you might get the tube fare. It's very rewarding. I worked with some great people who are now doing brilliantly well. So you have, moments of networking and also, creative expression, creative freedom. And crucially, he contrasted this with some of the big parts he'd had on the London stage, where he told us, once you get involved with a wonderful big theatre, your artistic input and creativity isn't as stimulated as it is in these kind of, smaller fringe or pub projects. So for him, the risks of unpaid labour were really to do with creative freedom and creative expression. Contrast this with, for example, Carla, in her 30s, working class woman. The way I am at the moment is I'll get what I'm given. There's so little work out there. I'm not desperate, but if it's the right role, then I'll do it for literally next to nothing. For her, it was really a story of essentially kind of economic exploitation and a lack of autonomy and choice. And this is something that we've been trying to kind of develop from the panic data to say that although unpaid labour is endemic to cultural creative industries, there's a big problem with internships, the idea of being able to work unpaid for 6 months a year in publishing, sometimes 2 years in London. Although that is a big problem that, say, public policy needs to intervene on, we have to be really careful to spot the different narrations of this. For some actors, working for free means we went to the Fringe for a month and we got commissioned, and now we're on telly. For other actors, it's, years of student films, crap free headshots, and essentially a career that goes nowhere. Yes, let's go with that. So, I said I'd talk about the kind of the broader ideal type that dominates the profession. What I've told you so far is essentially a kind of series of structural hurdles, perhaps, that people have to be able to overcome if they're going to be successful, if they're going to get in and get on in the profession. But also we think there's, a really sort of big barrier that isn't something you can just kind of get over or get around or negotiate, but rather something that we think, has to be resisted and really seriously needs to be publicly discussed and changed. And this is this ideal type, the kind of hegemonic, somatic norm of white male middle classness. We think this reflects the perception of, broadly speaking, writers and directors who are white male middle class. We have narratives from our white male middle class actors that tell us one story, and then the other half of our, or just over the other half of our respondents, of our interviewees, told us a very different story actually of, differing possibilities of resistance, some of which reflect the affordances of class, but also moral and political dilemmas about their continued ability to work in jobs that they felt were not just kind of risky or hard to sustain, but also might have certain reflections and certain assumptions about their communities that they really didn't want to replicate. So Molly, for example, from a affluent background, very well networked in London, had had some big success on stage, particularly up at the Edinburgh Festival. She told us about her frustration of female roles, passive, functional, pretty females being chased around by complex, interesting, hilarious men. She took a year out and became a writer. Basically, she said, I don't want to play these roles anymore. And so she was able, partially because of affluence, but also crucially because it didn't feel like completely unfamiliar territory. The work being a writer did, but her theatre upbringing, being in rehearsals, meeting actors, knowing through family people who become writers, that gave her a kind of a sense of possibility of doing this, I guess, form of resistance as being a writer. She also had very strong faith in the power of theatre to change things. Leah had a similar story about resisting typecasting, but ethnicity was much more prominent in her narrative of being a black British actor. Interestingly, her sense of being able to resist typecasting was essentially to kind of refuse roles that made her ethnicity prominent or focused particularly on things like, say, black theatre. She tells a story of wanting something bigger, wanting to go for a role that says ethnicity anyway, and the only barriers I see are the ones that I impose upon myself. Her and Molly, we think, because of their class backgrounds, when they encountered barriers associated with gender or ethnicity, essentially were able to kind of say, no, we refuse them. Interestingly, with Leah, what she was experiencing was huge amounts of unpaid work. At one point, I kind of said, so what have you been paid for? And she was like, yeah, not much actually. Although she'd done theatre work, she'd have film roles. Her kind of ability to resist parts that asked for, specifically black actresses, or wanted black actors to be part of, a definitely kind of different or resistant form of cultural expression. She'd essentially kind of sidestepped those as a mode of resistance and drew on her economic or class resources. Contrast this with Jim, white British guy in his 50s. He'd been, reasonably successful, had done a lot of soap work, been on telly quite a bit. He was really frustrated by the assumptions associated with social class by writers, casting directors and producers. So he got parts that were drug dealer one, drug taker, violent oddball. And crucially, although he found stability throughout his career, he made a really good living, it was a compromised living. He essentially was kind of sick of middle class people making working class programs, but knew that he had to play by their rules. You couldn't just say anything, or you get a reputation of being problematic, of being difficult, and then parts would dry up. Now this, I guess, kind of compromise of presenting working class life in a way that he was slightly unhappy with or felt was misrepresented was really brought into sharp focus when we spoke to Deborah from the northeast of England, I think Afro-Caribbean mum and white British dad, or maybe it's the other way around, I can't remember off the top of my head, but she was very explicit. Ethnicity defined her career, and it was ethnicity around her blackness. So as a black character actress, there's not a lot out there for us. So the writing, casting, producing system was not producing many parts for black character actors who were women. I played a hell of a lot of nurses. For her, her job was essentially play a nurse. It was never, why don't you play a doctor? Because the system of cultural production in Britain never assumed that a woman like her could play a doctor. That just isn't what British doctors look like on stage or screen. And crucially, her ability to resist had been sort of compromised. And she drew, explicitly, I was saying about kind of reflexivity, people being quite reflexive. She drew on her social class position. I don't have the confidence that a certain level of class gives you. I don't. I'd rather squeak in a corner than go up to somebody and say, I've got this great idea. and crucially, even when she encountered work, usually kind of state-funded or cultural policy-backed work to change this position she found herself, or at least change the system that she'd encountered that had limited her creative expression, she was encountering the assumptions of, again, a largely white, largely middle class, largely male writing and production system. So, she went to a project to develop Black British writers, particularly Black British female writers, and they'd asked her for a Pentecostal musical. They'd asked for, tales of an African war, American Black history, these kind of things. What that has to do with a woman from Newcastle, who knows? But again, the kind of assumptions of what I guess kind of is permissible for a black voice to put on stage and screen reflects the essentially racial prejudices of a largely white production system. And as she says, the chances of hearing real black, politically black voices in this country are still not being registered. And again, the story of her social mobility, a story about a middle-class mixed-race woman who's having doubts about who she is and where she is, that wouldn't be what gets commissioned. That isn't, I guess, what the production system thinks is either going to sell or is either appropriate to put on stage and screen. So, I've given you a sense of kind of how this plays out in a particular occupation. I've given you a sense of some of the kind of statistical underpinnings of inequality. I've not talked about theory at all. I've just been kind of presenting lots of empirical data. So in terms of what we're doing next, we've got a big kind of question about theorising lots of this stuff. Working with Sam in particular, he has kind of Logisian framework. I must admit I do not. So there's going to be interesting stuff around how we think about that. We're doing a paper at the moment with Siobhan McAndrew, who's at Bristol, around British social attitudes. What we found is cultural creative industries are ridiculously kind of liberal, anti-authoritarian, very left-wing in terms of social attitudes, whilst at the same time the sector is white, middle class, in parts very, very male. So how do we square up social liberalism with a fairly kind of exclusionary labour force, a fairly exclusionary labour market? We're thinking about what class actually means. That last comment from Deborah about her being middle class now because she's in the arts for a working class background is really interesting to us. And then these questions about the kind of issues about where we might intervene, particularly in a context where cultural memory, especially the 1980s, and the kinds of affordances of benefit systems, different education systems, etc., lead us in particular directions that maybe aren't true. We're trying to basically use some historical social mobility data to find out, has social mobility got better or worse in these jobs? And is it the case that actually the 60s, 70s and 80s were just as bad or perhaps even worse? And if that's the case, what do we do? Because what happens if this is like the golden age of social mobility for cultural jobs? It's pretty cramped. And I'll stop there. They're the papers I was talking about. Social identities. What else? Yeah, special issue of cultural sociology. A couple of working papers submitted to WES, and we're doing some revisions for the sociological research online at the moment. So